Symbiotic relationships between organisms are some of the most fascinating things to observe in nature. While generally assumed to have a positive connotation, there are actually three different types of symbiotic relationships. First is the mutualistic relationship, where both organisms benefit equally from each other, like honeybees feeding off of nectar while simultaneously helping to transport pollen between flowers. Next is the communalistic relationship, where one organism in the partnership benefits, while the other is left mostly unaffected. Think of scavengers following around packs of apex predators to take advantage of free leftovers. Finally, there's the parasitic relationship, where one organism benefits at the expense of the other. While the survival of the parasite depends on the survival of the host, the freeloading organism will eventually cause sickness in the host, potentially resulting in death. One of the greatest examples of this in nature is the relationship between the current generation of Starship Superheavy and its 33 Raptor 2 engines. With the apparent success of the fourth flight test of Starship, it's easy to become distracted by how well the booster's engines performed during all three phases of flight. But what you can't see when you look at this footage is the internal struggle occurring as the booster fights to prevent its own destruction for nearly 7.5 minutes. Make no mistake, this is the definition of a toxic relationship. These incredibly powerful engines are dependent on Superheavy to deliver a massive, uninterrupted supply of propellant. In return, while consuming these propellants, the Raptor engines are actively delivering harmful contaminants back into the booster. Not only do these contaminants have the potential to force an early shutdown of the booster's engines, but they can also lead to the complete destruction of the vehicle. Dealing with this issue has been one of the greatest challenges for Team Superheavy up to this point in the prototyping phase of development. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the origins of this contamination problem, examine its impact on the outcome of the first three flight tests, and then do our best to explain what SpaceX has done to mitigate the issue in order to achieve success on Flight 4. My name is Zach Golden, and this is another CSI Starbase Deep Dive Investigation. Hey Starship addicts, welcome and thanks for joining us. You know, it's not often that we actually get the chance to live up to the name of this channel. People often ask, where's the crime, Zach? And that's a fair question. Here at CSI Starbase, most of our episodes are typically deep dive investigations into how SpaceX approaches the various technical challenges that they face during the Starship development process. We take a lot of pride in being able to explain these advanced engineering topics in greater detail than you will find anywhere else with any other technology-related subject that you might be interested in. But like clockwork, once or twice a year, a truly serious case will fall into our laps and take us right back to the roots of this channel. And I guess it's that time of year again, because today, we're going to be reopening our investigation into a quadruple homicide. As of August of 2024, the Raptor 2 engine has been directly involved in the demise of Superheavy Booster 7, Booster 9, Booster 10, and Ship 28. 8 months ago, we released part 1 of How to Prevent Raptor from Destroying Superheavy. In that episode, we examined the sequence of events that led to the failure of Booster 7 during IFT-1. We also covered the upgrades that SpaceX made to prevent B7's predecessors from suffering the same fate. In an effort to isolate in-flight rapid unscheduled disassembly of Raptors and prevent them from taking out neighboring engines, SpaceX doubled the amount of blast shielding in Superheavy's aft section. To reduce the likelihood of uncontrolled gas leaks resulting in explosions and prevent engine fires from destroying important components and control systems, they supersized their onboard fire suppression system, making it 15 times larger than it was originally. From an outside perspective, these changes seemed to dramatically improve the relationship between Superheavy and its Raptors. But today, in part 2, you will see that Flight 1 problems were really just the beginning, and Raptor was not done wreaking havoc. This time, it would be a lot more discreet, attacking from the inside of the booster, effectively paralyzing the propellant distribution system. I think I can speak on behalf of Starship fans around the world when I say this. Out of all the ways that the booster could have possibly failed during the first 3 flight tests, I don't think clogged fuel filters was on anybody's bingo card 2 years ago. In my opinion, that makes this all the more interesting. Using the word fuel here is actually a bit misleading. The propellant filtration issue we will be discussing today is actually unique to the liquid oxygen side of the booster. So let's start off with a short review of the booster's engine plumbing. Out of the 17 individual tank and ring sections that make up the ship and booster, Superheavy's aft section is easily the most complex and impressive part of the entire Starship. Once fully integrated with the rest of the vehicle and its 33 Raptor engines, it's truly an incredible work of art. In appreciation of this masterpiece, we've added these incredible t-shirts created by Chameleon Circuit to the CSI Starbase merch store. Sadly, with the recent reveal of Booster 15's upgraded aft section, which now features 9 small tanks mounted to the side of the header tank, this design became outdated literally the same day I received mine in the mail. Incredible timing by the booster build team. So for a limited time, we're offering a 10% discount to the first 100 people to use this code. You can find the link in the description if you would like to pick one up for yourself. Anyway, Superheavy's propellant distribution system is responsible for delivering an uninterrupted supply of 3,300 tons of cryogenic liquid methane and oxygen over a period of 4 minutes and 15 seconds. Looking at this maze of pipework for the first time can be pretty intimidating, but thanks to Chameleon Circuit, we can once again go through this step by step and include some additional details that we didn't mention last time we covered this. At the bottom of the booster's liquid oxygen tank, there are more than 82 valves used to control the flow of propellants. The liquid oxygen side, which is our focus for today, there are 49 valves arranged in 5 unique groups feeding the 33 Raptor engines. This arrangement allows the booster to seamlessly swap between 3 different flight modes throughout its mission. During the ascent or boost phase of flight, all 33 engines will pull locks directly from the main tank. There are 20 flanged valves for the outer 20 engines mounted on the dome of the tank, 10 flanged valves mounted to the thrust puck assembly frame, and for the center engines, there are 3 pipes extending out from the center of the thrust puck into the main tank area. After MECO, the valves for the outer 20 engines are closed, and the ring of 10 engines enter somewhat of a standby mode, while the 3 center engines remain running. After stage separation and the initiation of the boost backburn, the middle ring of 10 reignite and continue to pull from the main tank. For the landing burn, the ring of 10 engines close the valves for the main tanks and begin pulling from the side of the header tank instead. The 3 center engines do the same thing, although they are pulling from the bottom of the landing tank. During the final phase of landing after the liquid drops below these inlet pipes, the 3 center engines are the only ones that can be used. In other words, this design does not allow for one of the other 10 engines to compensate for a center engine that has failed. Alright, now let's return to the main tank. In order to protect the engines from ingesting any solid contaminants that could cause damage to the impellers of the turbopumps, there are filters installed on each of the 30 flanged inlet valves. The overall purpose and design of these filters has changed between the first 2 generations of boosters. Depending on how long you have followed the Starship program, you may remember the alleged problems that SpaceX encountered with Booster 4 during its testing campaign. Although unconfirmed, it's widely believed that foreign objects and debris carelessly left inside of the propellant tanks managed to contaminate and damage internal plumbing on the booster and its 29 Raptor engines. This is one of the reasons why Booster 4 never progressed into static fire testing. We believe that, in an attempt to mitigate this issue, 8-sided box filters were installed in both Booster 4 and Booster 5. These are images taken after both vehicles were scrapped. After learning an important lesson from this unfortunate experience, cleanliness around the production area and inside of the vehicles was taken a lot more seriously. A good example of this are these removed before flight protective panels that are now installed over the methane sump for the booster's downcomer. Back in the day, they used to just kind of raw dog it. Wait, can I say that? Anyway, with the introduction of Raptor 2 on the current generation of boosters, the focus shifted from protecting against FOD to protecting against NOD. Native Object Debris. I realize this may not be a common term yet, but just think of it as a source of contamination that the Raptors are intentionally creating while being well aware that it's poisoning the booster in the process. The type of debris they were defending against in the Booster 4 days is significantly larger than what they knew they would be facing in this new situation. So, we believe these filters were upgraded starting with Booster 7. We have never managed to catch sight of the upgraded design, but they are likely similar to some of the filters found in the current version of the ship. Here is an example of one mounted to a valve in the late Ship 27's LOX tank. This is actually for one of the 3 liquid oxygen dump lines located inside of the aft skirt of the vehicle. Last thing you want is to lose the ability to drain the main LOX tank before landing the ship because a valve is clogged with ice. The equivalent filters for the booster's LOX inlet valves are much larger. If we look at photos of Booster 8's aft section as it was being scrapped, we can see the massive flanges, which are just over half a meter in diameter, on top of the valve assembly. On the outer edge of the flange, there are 14 bolts for mounting the filters. To maintain enough clearance with the methane pipes for the outer 20 engines, cylindrical filters will not work, so they are likely tapered inwards as shown in this render. As I said before, there are at least 30 of these filters. What remains unknown is how they protect the 3 center engines. This is still a mystery because of the way the inlet valves are tucked inside of the buckets created by the thrust puck assembly structure. The filters used to protect the other engines are far too large to fit in this space. These are arguably the most important engines on the booster. They are the only ones that have to remain running all the way through stage separation and the end of the boost back burn. They are also critical for the landing burn since they are responsible for guiding the vehicle in for its final touchdown. Because they have the longest runtime, they are the most at risk for becoming clogged. So with that said, they surely cannot go unprotected. A speculative solution for this would be to install a mesh screen to cover each of the 3 buckets, but since we have no evidence that these exist, they won't be included in any of the other renders or animations later in the episode. It's probably also worth discussing the landing tank here, but I'll save that for the end of the episode. All of the LOX filtration related issues on flights 2 and 3 occurred during the boost back phase, so the landing tank isn't really relevant for this part of the discussion. Alright, I think that just about covers the important background information regarding the original filtration system designed for boosters 7 and 9. Now, let's take a look at the progression of this problem over the first 4 flight tests of Starship. On the first integrated flight test, Booster 7 did not survive long enough to reach the point of stage separation. Stage separation appears to be the earliest point in flight where the liquid oxygen filtration issue begins to cause serious problems. For this reason, it's possible that SpaceX was unaware of the severity of this issue until the following attempt. 7 months later, during IFT2, Booster 9 suffered a catastrophic disruption of its liquid oxygen supply shortly after the hot staging sequence as it was initiating the boost back burn. This was by far the most dramatic occurrence of this in-flight anomaly, as it resulted in the rapid destruction of the booster. Returning viewers to the channel will remember the deep dive investigation where I examined a list of possible modes of failure for Booster 9. We're going to revisit that again later in this episode, now that we have a better understanding. Before Flight 3, the Superheavy engineering team made several important upgrades which were intended to increase the robustness of the filtration system. The Flight 3 upgrades resulted in a much better performance for Booster 10, but it ultimately still failed in a similar fashion as Booster 9. This time, the filter blockages caused 6 out of the 13 center engines to experience an early shutdown near the end of the boost back burn. So, Team Superheavy went back to the drawing board again and made even more upgrades. As mentioned in the live broadcast,
now for today's flight, we upgraded those filters further and made some additional hardware and software changes to increase our chances of igniting all 13 engines for the landing burn.
And just as they hoped, the performance of Booster 11 was nearly flawless during the 4th flight test. All 13 engines relit as intended for the full duration of the boost back burn. 3 minutes and 21 seconds later, all but 1 engine were able to successfully relight for the landing burn. Minus the engine that failed to start at liftoff, and the other that abandoned its team during the landing burn, everything seemed to go really well. This brings us to the main question of today's episode. Does the apparent success of Superheavy's performance during Flight 4 mean that the LOX filtration issue has officially been resolved? Well, I'm going to reserve my opinion on that for now until we finish examining the evidence. Let's start by taking a few steps back so we can get an understanding of how and why an estimated 4 metric tons of ice is materializing out of thin air inside of the LOX tank. If you've seen part 1 of the Everyday Astronaut's recent tour of Starbase, you probably heard Allan explain that the ice is actually a byproduct of the autogenous pressurization system for the liquid oxygen tank.
The location that we're tapping off the engine is not pure O2. It's got a little bit of water ice.
Why does it have?
It's ox-rich gas.
It is ox. So is it coming off the actual?
Yeah.
Like exhaust or the turbine side?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So wouldn't it have? Wouldn't it even have a little bit of?
It's ox-rich gas, but it's got burnt fuel.
Yes. Wouldn't it have a little bit of CO2 in it too then? And can that turn into an ice?
Yeah.
This will make a lot more sense in a few minutes, but Tim was kind of onto something really important there. I don't know if it was intentional, but Allan definitely sidestepped the second part of Tim's question. That may have actually been worth the Heisman Trophy. In all seriousness, shout out to the Everyday Astronaut because it's really helpful to be able to get information like this directly from the Chief Technology Officer at SpaceX. It's crazy how difficult it is these days to cut through the riffraff of unreliable information just to get a straight answer. especially as it relates to the spaceflight industry. While it may not help with this particular topic, the best way I've found to verify sources of information and get all sides of any story is from Ground News, the amazing sponsor of today's episode. Ground News is an aggregator that collects news stories from more than 50,000 outlets published all over the world and consolidates them into a single, easy-to-read newsfeed. For every story you find on Ground News, you can not only find a high-level summary, but you can sift through the headlines for other news outlets covering the same story and quickly find vital information about that outlet's political affiliations, its factuality rating, and the company's ownership. What's really awesome is that Ground News was developed by former NASA engineer Harleen Kaur, whose mission was to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. Well, I can personally say mission accomplished. While I'm neck deep into the creation process for these episodes, it's often difficult to find the time to dig around for trusted information into other topics that I care about, like the details and ramification of NASA's decision to not allow Starliner to return Butch and Sunny back to Earth. After a quick search, you can see that Ground News found 445 different sources covering this story, with a majority coming from left and center publications. With only 17% coming from right-leaning sources, you may not even be aware of this ongoing situation at all, if that's where you get a majority of your news. With that said, if you want to know how different news outlets cover the same story, you can easily scroll through and see how the headlines change depending on their affiliation. Being able to make these comparisons is one of the reasons why I use Ground News every day. But it's not the only one. I also love features like their blind spot page, which shows you stories that are receiving disproportionate coverage in one political sphere versus the other. It not only helps me make sure that I don't have these blind spots, but it also helps me to better understand how the world can look very different depending on someone's political affiliation. In today's media climate, that's more important than ever, which is why I'm a big fan of Ground News, and I think you will be too. In fact, I can even give you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/CSI Starbase to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/CSI Starbase to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Alright, now let's get back to discussing this autogenous pressurization system wreaking havoc on the inside of the booster. I've mentioned it on countless episodes, but for those who don't know, the autogenous pressurization system is responsible for maintaining ullage pressure inside of the tanks during flight. As the two cryogenic liquid propellants are being consumed by the Raptor engines at an astronomical rate, vaporized gas is injected into the top of the tanks to replace the propellants as they are drained. This ullage gas helps maintain the necessary inlet pressure to feed the turbopumps. It also increases the structural integrity of the tank and prevents it from collapsing in on itself. During the first few seconds of flight, you can actually see the excess autogen gas being dumped overboard from both fuel tanks on the booster. Here it is coming out of one of the vents next to the grid fins at the top of the methane tank. This is much easier to see on the liquid oxygen side, thanks to the long vapor trail that forms in front of the booster. It appears that the engines start off producing more gas than what is needed to backfill the tanks shortly after liftoff. While the propellant levels are near their maximum, the volume of gas at the top of the tank is very small, and therefore more sensitive to rapid pressure changes. If you aren't generating enough gas, the ullage pressure will quickly drop below a safe level, which could have catastrophic consequences. By overproducing autogen gas, you guarantee that you have a sufficient supply to the tanks during the most delicate phase of flight. On the flip side, it also doesn't take much to overpressure the tanks at this time. But to prevent that, you can simply open the depress valves to bleed off excess gas. It's always better to have too much than not enough.
Okay, hold on, Zach. I'm going to interrupt you right here.
Oh, hey Jax, what up?
What you just said there may be true. But as with anything, there's some exceptions.
Okay, care to offer an example?
Well, in a completely hypothetical situation, if the flight termination system was designed to puncture the tanks and depressurize them to drive a structural failure, then you'd want to be losing pressure faster than it's being generated. If the pressurization system was fighting back enough, and the puncture wasn't very large, then the vehicle may not even break apart, and in fact, the engines might not even cut off as intended.
Well, damn. I suppose that's a good point. You definitely would not want your autogen system to outperform the FTS. I guess one way to prevent that would be to install larger explosive charges so that you can punch larger holes in the tank. Anyway, for a while, a lot of us armchair engineers had suspected that the autogenous pressurization was the source of ice formation in the LOX tank. In reality, it's really the only possible answer. But the confirmation of this theory has officially altered our understanding of the Raptor engine functionality in a very confusing way. I admit, at first, even I was in denial about this, which is why I only gave it a brief mention as a possibility in my deep dive investigation into the failure of Booster 9. I think the first question a lot of people naturally ask themselves after hearing Elon's explanation is why the accumulation of ice is an issue in the liquid oxygen tank, but not the methane tank. Well, the reason for this is because of a crucial difference in how the autogenous pressurization gases for the LOX and methane tanks are being generated inside of the engines. This is probably the most complex topic we will cover today. I'm going to try to explain this in the simplest way possible so it's easy to follow. To help us out along the way, I'm going to reference a few schematics from the NASA Spaceflight Forum. So let's walk through this. On the fuel side of the Raptor engine, liquid methane enters the turbopump where the pressure is boosted from around 4 bar up to nearly 900 bar. That's equivalent to 58 psi up to 13,000 psi for my fellow Americans. From there, the methane is routed to the throat of the engine nozzle where it's split between two paths. The first goes down through the nozzle where it passes through internal capillaries that form the inner and outer walls. Inside of this regenerative cooling circuit, a massive amount of thermal energy is transferred through the inner wall of the nozzle into the liquid methane. This is more than enough to vaporize the liquid methane, but because of the high pressure, it will transition into a supercritical fluid. Supercritical is a phase that exists between liquid and gas. This process simultaneously cools the nozzle while providing vaporized methane for the fuel-rich preburner. The second path is part of the cooling circuit as well, except it's around the main combustion chamber instead of the nozzle. Before the supercritical methane flow reaches the preburner where it will be mixed with oxygen, a small percentage is removed and sent to a common manifold in the booster's aft section. Here, it combines with gas from the other 32 engines and is then transferred up to the methane tank via 2 pipes on the front and back side of the booster. This same process occurs on the ship as well. For the sake of being as thorough as possible for the super nerds out there, I should also point out that on Raptor 1, it's believed that the vaporized methane gas was passed through an additional heat exchanger located inside of the hot gas manifold after the fuel turbine. This heat exchanger was used to further increase the temperature of the autogen gas while reducing the temp of the preburner exhaust. Raising the temperature of the gas will increase the volume and pressure. By increasing the volume, it reduces the amount of particles required to achieve the same ullage pressure inside of the tanks during flight. As a result, less gas is removed from the combustion process and the parasitic load on the turbopump is decreased. Without this heat exchanger, the turbopump would be forced to work harder to make up for the reduced mass flow rate to the preburner. The most important detail here is that the gas is sourced from a location after the regenerative cooling loop and before the preburner. As a result, there should be pure methane gas delivered back to the tank, so there will be no risk of contaminants forming into solid particles inside of the tank.
Our rocket is autogenously pressurized,
Yep.
so we're pressurizing the fuel side with gaseous fuel and the oxide with mostly gaseous oxygen.
The fact that the only known form of filtration on the methane side is a single filter box with anti-vortex baffles located at the top of the downcomer seems to support this explanation. If ice was forming in the methane tank at a similar rate as it does on the LOX side, then this lone filter would probably fail long before they reach stage separation. Anyway, the reason this is confusing is because ever since the beginning of Raptor development, it's been widely assumed that a similar process was happening on the LOX side of the engine. Liquid oxygen vaporized into a gaseous state inside of a heat exchanger. If we look again at the diagram of Raptor 1, you can see where a small percentage of high-pressure liquid oxygen is diverted away after passing through the turbopump. Most of this is sent to the fuel-rich preburner, where it's used in the combustion process to spin the fuel pump turbine. Another portion is routed to a heat exchanger located somewhere after the LOX preburner and turbine. Just like the cooling loop on the methane side, this preburner exhaust transfers thermal energy to the high-pressure liquid oxygen within the heat exchanger, causing it to vaporize. A design like this should send pure gaseous oxygen to a second common manifold and then into the top of the liquid oxygen tank. Of course, this is not an official diagram provided by SpaceX, so there's really no way to determine whether or not this was truly a feature on Raptor 1. With that said, whether this oxygen heat exchanger was eliminated on Raptor 2 to reduce mass and complexity of the engine, or if it was never there to begin with, it certainly does not exist now. This was also confirmed by Allan during the Everyday Astronaut's tour of Starbase.
Now, in the case of autogenously pressurized, we have to create the gas. We're not merely warming up a gas. We have to produce the gas.
Oh.
There was some confusion as to whether or not Allan was saying the same thing about the methane side of the engine here as well. A lot of folks have suggested that Allan implied that the heat exchanger on the methane side was also removed. If that's the case, then that was most likely referring to the heat exchanger around the hot gas manifold, and not the actual cooling loop in the nozzle. The cooling loop is essentially a heat exchanger already, so they can still tap into it for autogenous pressurization. Removing the secondary heat exchanger would just eliminate the ability to precisely control the temperature and pressure of the gas. Reducing the mass and complexity of the system was probably a worthy trade-off here. It may remove more methane from the combustion cycle and force the turbopump to work harder, but at least it doesn't introduce a similar issue to what's currently happening on the liquid oxygen side. Instead of using pure gaseous oxygen generated by a heat exchanger, the autogenous pressurization system for the LOX tank uses what is essentially contaminated oxygen gas generated by the preburner. Inside of the LOX preburner, 90% of the liquid oxygen from the LOX turbopump is mixed with about 10% of the methane from the fuel pump, where it's ignited and used to spin the turbine. After exiting the turbine, a small portion of this preburner exhaust is diverted from the hot gas manifold and sent to the liquid oxygen tank for the autogen system. Because the methane injected into the preburner will only require a small percentage of the LOX to complete the combustion reaction, a majority of what's sent back to the tank will be oxygen. But the preburner exhaust will also contain water vapor and CO2 gas, which are the main byproducts of methalox combustion. Because there are trace amounts of nitrogen involved in this reaction, there are other byproducts that will exist here as well, but those aren't really important for this explanation. All we really need to understand is that 1 mole of CH4 reacting with 2 moles of O2 produces 1 mole of CO2 and 2 moles of H2O. Because there are 44 grams per mole of CO2 and 15 grams per mole of H2O, there will be slightly more CO2 than H2O by mass. This mixture of O2 with an unknown percentage of CO2 and water vapor will be extremely hot inside of the autogen transfer pipe as it's traveling up the side of the booster. You can actually see that in this thermal footage from Lab Padre's Predator camera. After the static fire, the autogen pipe on the back side of the booster is glowing white hot. After leaving the preburner at more than 500 degrees Celsius, it will cool down a bit inside of the 2 autogen pipes, which are mounted against the side of the iced over LOX tank. In another example from that thermal cam, the autogen pipes are much cooler when more of the tank is frosted over, even though this was a longer duration static fire test. At the top of the oxygen tank, there are 2 sets of curved perforated pipes which distribute the gas into the tank. The pressure of the gas inside of the autogen pipes should be somewhere around 500 bar, which is the expected pressure of the gas after the turbine. After exiting the injection manifold, it will expand into the larger volume of the tank, where the pressure will drop down to about 6 bar. This pressure drop will also cause the temperature to decrease instantly. If the temperature of the ullage gas drops below 100 degrees Celsius, the water vapor from the preburner exhaust will begin to condense back into a liquid and essentially start raining inside of the tank. It will quickly freeze once it makes contact with the liquid oxygen. Some of it may also stick to the walls of the tank to form sheets of ice like what we see on the external surfaces of the tanks. This is actually what ended up causing the reaction control system valves to freeze up on Ship 28 during the 3rd flight test. We aren't going to really get into that today though. I'd rather keep our focus on the Superheavy. Now, here's where things start to get interesting. The density of water ice is 917 kilograms per cubic meter, while the liquid oxygen is around 1,141 kilograms per cubic meter, which means the water ice that forms on the surface of the liquid oxygen will float on top. The molecules may even combine on the surface to form sheets of ice. While undesirable, it really shouldn't cause issues during flight because the only way this ice will reach the bottom of the tank is if the booster runs out of fuel, or if significant mixing occurs as a result of excessive fuel slosh. An example of this type of mixing occurred during the 2nd flight test of Starship. In our IFT2 analysis episode, we discussed the spike in negative acceleration that occurred during hot staging as a result of the ship aggressively pushing away from the booster. At the time of creating this simulation, we were working under the assumption that the fuel slosh was the main issue, and we were not really factoring ice into the situation at all. So what's not shown here is what happens to the ice that's been forming on the inner walls of the tank over the last 2.5 minutes. The force of the ship giving the Will Smith treatment to the booster as hard as it did could have caused a lot of this ice to break off and fall into the liquid. Any water ice floating on the surface of this liquid would have been tossed around the tank and could briefly end up at the bottom near the filters, where there would be a risk of it being sucked in by the inlet valves. This risk would not last for very long though, as the ice would float back up to the top of the liquid once the fuel sloshing is calmed down. Given that the first engine failures didn't begin until about 8 seconds after this moment of negative acceleration, I don't think water ice is really the source of filter clogging. It's mostly a problem for the valves used on the reaction control thrusters, not the propulsion system. With that out of the way, let's discuss that other preburner exhaust contaminant being sent into the LOX tank. Unlike water vapor, when carbon dioxide enters the tank, it may skip the liquid phase entirely depending on the ullage pressure and will transition to a solid at around -57 degrees Celsius. The CO2 molecule is about 1.4 times heavier than oxygen, which means it will fall to the bottom of the gas column while the oxygen molecules remain above. The temperature on the surface of the liquid oxygen is going to be just below its boiling point at around -164 degrees Celsius. So as the CO2 reaches the liquid gas boundary, it will solidify into dry ice. Liquid oxygen contamination is a very well-researched phenomenon in the aerospace industry. Solid carbon dioxide, or dry ice, is commonly referred to as CO2 snow and is known to be extremely difficult to filter out of a liquid oxygen solution. The formation of CO2 snow can be accelerated dramatically depending on the severity of fuel slosh in the tanks during hot staging. This is due to a process known as ullage collapse. I'm not really going to get into that today, but I promise it will come up in a future episode when I discuss the orbital tank farm transformation. What is important to note is that because the density of dry ice is 1.3 times greater than liquid oxygen, it will sink to the bottom instead of floating on the surface like water ice. The particles of CO2 snow may be similar to grains of sand falling through the water. Because of this, in the animations we are using to demonstrate this concept, Brian Hansen's base increased the particle size while reducing the particle count to make the snow easier to see. The greater the acceleration of the booster, the faster the snow particles will fall to the bottom of the tank. And if the direction of the acceleration vector changes, the direction the particles are falling will change as well. Keep that in mind for this next part. Once these particles get near the bottom of the tank, they will be sucked in towards the filters where they will be trapped in place. As they continue to accumulate over time, it will eventually cause a significant drop in pressure at the LOX inlets due to the flow restrictions.
This type of flow restriction will either result in a failure to restart engines for boost back, an early shutdown if it's detected quickly enough, or it could cause the engines to self-destruct. Now, here's where we need to use our imaginations. Knowing this information, let's reevaluate the footage from Flight 2, 3, and 4 and see if there are any additional observations we can make. Even without a detailed post-incident report from SpaceX, there's quite a bit of information we can get from the on-screen telemetry data provided during the live broadcasts. When viewing the launch footage at 24 frames per second, the speed and altitude values are updated 24 times for every second of flight. So we basically have a data resolution of about 41 milliseconds. This is a lot more useful than the 1-second resolution data you may have seen posted in various places online. Honestly, it's awesome that SpaceX is even outputting data at this high of a resolution during the live stream. The only way it could possibly get better is if they added a few decimal places for the altitude reading or decided to include the downrange distance as well. Anyway, after the incredibly painful process of scraping all of this data by hand, converting units, performing a few transformations, and smoothing the data, we can make some very interesting comparisons. Before we do that, I'll explain to you what we're looking at here.
Looking at the Flight 2 speed and acceleration data from Booster 9, you can see the moment when the acceleration peaks at about 1.7 Gs at the end of the ascent phase before falling to a negative value after MECO. The booster and ship continue forward for about 7 seconds while slowly losing momentum. Next is the hot staging maneuver. A few moments before second stage ignition, Booster 9 appears to increase throttle on its 3 center engines. I think this is in preparation to counter the thrust from the ship.
A little premature acceleration, if you will.
In my opinion, this seems to be an extremely counterproductive move. By increasing the thrust from the booster, the ship must also use greater thrust in order to avoid a collision. So once Ship 25 ignited its 6 Raptor engines with even more thrust than it would otherwise require, it aggressively pushed the booster backwards, causing a peak negative acceleration of close to 2 Gs. It's important to note that the peak acceleration from the raw data was nearly 3 times greater. Unfortunately, once you smooth the data, the magnitude of these peaks are reduced dramatically. The good news is, this doesn't really matter because we're still able to make accurate comparisons since we did the same thing to all 3 datasets. Back to the point, because of the premature acceleration from the booster, the speed of the ship makes a brief but noticeable jump after ignition. This is also an indication of how hard the ship pushes away from the booster. After this, we have the boost back initiation where the ring of 10 engines restart while Superheavy is still performing its flip maneuver. At this point, you will notice the speed climb for a few seconds while Booster 9 is still partially accelerating downrange. Once it completes its U-turn, it begins canceling out the downrange velocity. Even though this data has been manipulated to smooth out the trend lines, it still appears to be reasonably accurate. If you look closely,
you can actually see bumps in the acceleration plot each time an engine is lost. Speaking of the engine diagram, in order to truly make use of this, it's helpful if we synchronize it with the orientation of the booster. Unless you know what to look for, it's a bit difficult to figure out the proper orientation. If we look at an engine diagram, what we need to find is the engine from the center group, which is perfectly aligned with the other engines from the ring of 10. If you draw a line through those two engines, it will end up centered on the booster QD.
Feel free to pause this in case you want to look at that pattern more closely. Now, as the booster begins turning towards the camera, think of this diagram as if you're looking at the engines from the top of the booster. It's very difficult to track the orientation of the booster through this turn maneuver because of the exposure settings on the camera. The key is to identify the positions of the chines and strakes whenever they become visible. The strakes are the smaller pair of aero covers on the front side of the booster. The chines are the larger set in the back, which are mounted about 120 degrees apart from each other. When you look at them from behind, you can see that the edges actually stick out wider than the 9-meter diameter of the booster. Because of this, you can easily see the back side of the booster when you're looking at it from the front. Thick, with 2 C's. Now, I'm not going to waste your time going through the process of lining up the chines frame by frame. Feel free to go back and verify for yourself if you have trust issues or something. Returning to the footage and focusing on the diagram, you can see that about halfway through the 180-degree turn, Booster 9 performs an unnecessary roll maneuver. Showing off, basically. The reason I say that is because this is the complete opposite direction from where it needs to go. Let's explain that real quick.
As the booster is lifting off from the pad, the quick disconnect panel is initially facing towards the integration tower. When it returns for landing, it needs to be facing the same direction as well. This is assuming that SpaceX plans to catch the booster directly over the launch mount instead of off to the side. Both the chopstick landing animation released by SpaceX and the procedure for Stage 0 observed during the 4th flight test seem to point towards this being the plan. This becomes a bit more obvious when we look at this footage from cosmic perspective, which I've synced with SpaceX's live broadcast. When you have these two videos properly aligned, you can see that the deluge system is activated just moments before the landing burn is initiated. I think the chopstick timing was a little off here for some reason, but they're definitely positioned directly over the launch mount.
Quick side note here, I initially planned on doing a deep dive investigation into the design of Mechazilla to explain the operational procedures that you will see during the first catch attempt. There seems to be a lot of confusion and misinformation out there, which I think needs to be cleared up. Unfortunately, I'm quickly running out of time, and there's no way I can pull that off before Flight 5. Luckily, Ryan Hansen Space has got you all covered. I can't give a release date yet due to a slight delay as a result of him simultaneously working on the simulations used in this investigation, but Ryan's CSI-style deep dive should answer any questions you could possibly have as it relates to the first booster catch attempt. This will be a massive update to his original Starship OFT video, with more than 15 minutes of incredibly detailed technical animations explaining each part of the system. I promise you will not want to miss this. If you haven't subscribed to his channel yet, make sure to do so. Like, seriously, pause the video right now and go handle that. I'll wait. Anyway, let's get back to explaining these boost-back shenanigans.
Shortly after liftoff, the booster begins pitching downrange and performs a 90-degree roll maneuver so the tiles are facing south towards Mexico. This orientation is maintained all the way through hot staging. Before most engine cutoff, the vehicle pitches forward sharply to begin leveling off its flight path. Before ignition, Booster 9 turns its grid fins so they're sloped up towards the front side of the ship. After second stage ignition, the interaction between the exhaust plume and the grid fins causes the booster to be pushed to the right towards Mexico, while it continues flattening out its flight path to put it parallel with the Earth. The thrust vector control for the 3 center engines is acting in the same direction and takes control of the turn after the initial push by the grid fins. This is actually very similar to the flip maneuver for a Falcon Heavy sidecore booster, which uses reaction control thrusters to initiate the turn instead of grid fins. Another difference is that the engines restart much earlier on Super Heavy, so there is a bit of a power slide action going on as well. After performing the 180-degree U-turn, the booster's QD will be facing south. This needs to be corrected so that the QD is pointing towards the ground. That way, after the boost back burn when Super Heavy pitches upwards prior to re-entry, the QD ends up pointing back towards the launch site. Shout out to Knaggs for creating this animation for us. Now that we understand this, hopefully you will see why I called this an unnecessary maneuver. the booster rolls 60 degrees counterclockwise so the QD is facing upwards, the exact opposite of where it should be. As this roll is happening, the booster loses 3 engines in a clockwise pattern, skipping over the one that was already dead. I have a feeling that had this engine successfully relit for the boost back burn, it would have ended up failing in sequence with the other 3. So now that the booster is facing the wrong direction, it has to do a 150-degree roll to get back to the position that it needs to be in. Unfortunately, as soon as it begins rolling back in the clockwise direction, 4 more engines fail in sequence, this time in a counterclockwise pattern.
Huh. Well, I'll be damned. Talk about f around and find out. I wouldn't say all my flabbers are gasted, but that is an interesting coincidence. Now, let's take a look at Flight 3.
During the ascent phase on the 3rd flight test, Booster 10 and Ship 28 performed the same 90-degree roll maneuver after launch, with the tiles once again facing towards the south. Before most engine cutoff, the grid fins are rotated while the vehicle pitches upwards this time, like it's about to bust a kickflip. With the grid fins turned up in the same direction as they were on Flight 2, it's again pushed to the right after second stage ignition. Instead of steering the vehicle in the same direction as the grid fin push, the thrust vector control system for the 3 center engines begins to initiate a backflip. When viewed from the ground, you can more clearly see it arcing up and to the right. We will revisit this here in a few minutes. By turning in this direction, SpaceX has adjusted the flip maneuver so it more closely resembles a Falcon 9 RTLS boost back burn. I think the goal here might be to reduce the time and propellant spent turning the booster back towards the launch site and increase its apogee before re-entry. When we look at the telemetry data, you can see that MECO actually occurred slightly later on Flight 3 than it did on Flight 2. The booster is traveling at a higher speed as well. As a result, the ship starts off with a higher initial velocity after stage separation. If we shift this to align MECO on both plots, you can see that second stage ignition occurs about half a second faster on the second attempt. When we compare second stage ignition, it seems clear that SpaceX successfully managed to dial back the initial startup thrust from the ship because the push-off is a lot more gentle. If you try to judge this by looking at the footage alone, it's nearly impossible to spot any differences outside of the changes to the flip maneuver. It also doesn't help that one of these is a ground camera while the other is on board the ship. There are a lot of interesting details that stand out when you synchronize the moment of hot staging. When we take a look at the acceleration data, you can see that Booster 10 was a lot more patient than Booster 9 and maintained a constant acceleration until after second stage ignition. Since it was no longer competing against the early throttle increase from the booster, the initial acceleration from the ship was able to be reduced. This time around, there was no spike in acceleration from Ship 28, which confirms that the initial push-off was a lot less aggressive. As a result, the magnitude of the spike in negative acceleration by the booster was cut in half. Because B-10 waited until after second stage ignition to begin countering the pushback from the ship, it took slightly longer for it to recover. But this is an indication that the 3 center engines weren't working as hard to do so either.
A more gradual recovery reduces the shock to the vehicle, which decreases the likelihood of water ice breaking off from the inner walls of the tank. But I don't think that really matters anyway. More importantly, it should reduce fuel slosh in the tanks, which will make the guidance system very happy. All right, now let's return to that flip maneuver.
As a reminder, instead of a flat U-turn towards the south, the booster has just performed a backflip. After the flip, the front side of the booster will be facing the same direction as it was before stage separation, to the north. It also rotated about 20 degrees upwards, as you can see here. Once again, this is not the correct orientation for landing. Up to this point, the engines are still healthy and everything seems to be going well. It's now time for the avionics computer to show off a little bit and perform a beautiful, yet semi-aggressive roll maneuver to get the front of the booster in the correct orientation for the entry and landing phase. As the booster is executing this roll while flying parallel to the ground, it's important to remember that there will be a gravitational force acting in the direction of the Earth. While the booster may have 3 Gs of acceleration pointing back towards the launch site, there will also be roughly 1 G of acceleration pulling the booster and everything inside of it towards the ground. 20 seconds after initiating this maneuver, the booster QD is now pointing towards the Earth, and this is where things begin to go wrong. 5 seconds after canceling out the roll, multiple engines from the Ring of 10 begin failing in sequence, starting from the bottom of the Earth-facing side of the tank and working its way around in a symmetrical pattern. So, the booster has now lost 6 engines, and they all happen to be on the same Earth-facing side of the tank.
I don't know.
Either this is a ridiculously crazy coincidence, or there is a real pattern here. If you ask me, I think it's starting to look like Superheavy might be severely allergic to roll maneuvers. So what's going on here? Thanks to some incredibly amazing animations by Ryan Hansen Space, I think we should be able to visualize this problem. But as a forewarning, this is the part of the episode where we bring in the heavy speculation. Let's take a look at what might be going on with the CO2 snow inside of the LOX tank during both of these situations. Starting again with Flight 2. Leading up to the moment of stage separation, it's been snowing inside of the tank for roughly 2 minutes and 40 seconds as the autogenous pressurization system willingly introduces carbon dioxide contaminants into the liquid oxygen tank. By the end of the ascent phase burn, there will be a lot of snow particles that have already made their ways to the bottom of the tank. Using the formulas given in John Livingston's Raptor rocket cycle analysis, we've estimated that there should be roughly 2,305 kilograms of solid carbon dioxide in the tank by the end of the boost back burn. Depending on the density, that could be somewhere between 1.3 to 1.5 cubic meters of ice. Spread out evenly over a 9-meter circle, you would end up with 2.1 to 2.3 centimeters of snow. That's just under 1 inch.
These particles will likely spread uniformly throughout the volume of liquid oxygen during the boost phase of flight. Even though the liquid is still being rapidly drained from the tanks, the snow particles will fall even faster because of their density. Some of these snow particles will come to rest on the bottom of the tank, while a large portion of it will be sucked towards the LOX inlet valves, where it will stick to the surface of the filters.
Once the outer 20 boost engines and the ring of 10 engines shut down prior to hot staging, the suction force keeping the ice pressed against the filters will disappear. The acceleration from the 3 center engines may help keep some of the particles attached, or they might just fall to the bottom of the tank. Unfortunately, in this animation, Ryan was not able to get the filters to actually release the attraction force. Throughout the process of creating most of these animations, he ended up spending most of his time fighting against the limitations of Blender 3D's particle system. In order to make this work, he had to significantly reduce the amount of particles in the simulation and cut out some of the fluid dynamics we were trying to show here. I don't know, maybe one day the Blender developers will step their game up.
Anyway, as Booster 9 begins accelerating through the 180-degree U-turn, the suspended snow particles will want to shift towards the north-facing side of the vehicle. But while the booster is still gaining altitude, it's also being pulled back down by gravity. So there will be a second component of acceleration pulling the particles towards the Earth-facing side of the tank. The good news is, the majority of particles generated during the ascent phase should have already made it to the bottom of the tank and will remain there, at least until the booster starts performing random barrel rolls. In this home experiment, I threw some ice cubes into a bowl of liquid oxygen that I had laying around my house so we can observe what happens when the bowl is being rotated. As you can see, the walls of the container are moving, but the liquid wants to remain stationary except near the edges. It's kind of scary to think what happens when you scale this experiment up to a 9-meter wide tank, especially when you consider the 60 stringers sticking up from the dome, 10 deep troughs created by the thrust puck assembly frame, 20 methane pipes for the boost engines, 10 liquid oxygen downpipes going from the landing tank to the inner ring of engines, and 30 gigantic filters for the LOX inlet valves.
So during the roll maneuver, the LOX tank basically turns into a giant washer machine agitator. The turbulence in the liquid created by all these components will likely lift the snow particles from wherever they are resting and stir them up inside of the tank. I think the particle agitation effect would likely be a lot more aggressive than what's shown here, but again, Ryan did the best he could within the limits of the software.
When the booster rolls counterclockwise, the particles will want to stay in place, but will appear to be swirling in the opposite direction. Because it's laying on its side, the cloud of snow will likely gather to one side where it will overload the filters and starve the engines. Once again, after the engines fail, the suction force will disappear from those positions, and the previously trapped particles will be free to move around again. When the booster rolls back in the opposite direction, the cloud will move counterclockwise this time and take out more engines one by one as it passes over the filters.
It's really crazy when you look at it this way thanks to the synchronized engine diagram. If you agree, then I don't know, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. So if this is how it really went down, then what could they do to prevent it from occurring again? This is where the Flight 3 upgrades come into play. During the live broadcasts, the host mentioned hardware upgrades inside of the liquid oxygen tank to improve filtration.
The likely cause was determined to be filter blockage where liquid oxygen is supplied to the engines. So we've upgraded hardware inside the oxygen tank to improve filtration capabilities in our boosters, including the one that's out on the pad today.
This was a pretty vague statement as expected, so we have had to piece this together for ourselves. Luckily for us, there are really only a few realistic solutions that wouldn't require a major redesign of either the booster or the Raptor engines. So that makes things a bit easier. Eliminating the source of contamination which is clogging the filters in the first place seems to be out of the question. So instead, I think the only logical solution would be to increase the total surface area of the filtration medium.
The first way to do this is to simply replace all 30 of the individual filters and make them larger. This would extend the time it takes for the accumulation of ice to begin starving the engines. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the diameter of the filters cannot be increased without colliding with the methane pipes for the outer 20 Raptors. You can see how close the existing flanges are to touching those pipes already. The only way to make them larger would be to extend the cone outwards. By extending the filter cones by 50%, the surface area increases from 1.1 square meters up to 1.6.
Theoretically, this might increase the time it takes for the filters to become clogged by 45%, which is a lot depending on how long they were even lasting to begin with. In this situation, a more effective option would be to filter the liquid oxygen tank itself. The turbopump inlet filters are only half a meter wide, while the booster is 9 meters across. If you can stop the contamination from reaching the bottom of the tank in the first place, then it takes a lot of pressure off the inlet filters. Pun intended. To put this into perspective, the total combined surface area of the inlet filters is about 33 square meters. The hypothetical extended version increases that to 48 square meters. If you can add a strainer or sieve screen over the full cross-sectional area around the tank, the surface area increases to 76 square meters, and 104 square meters if you have 2 layers. Combined, these 2 upgrades result in a 315% increase in the total surface area of the filtration medium.
With that said, when Booster 10 emerged from the Megabay after final outfitting, there were new weld marks on the outside of the tank that immediately stood out. These are twice as large as the original slosh baffle mounting brackets, and there are 3 times as many of them. Thanks to these images from Starship Gazer, where we got a lucky shot through the access hatch of the recently unveiled Booster 15 aft section, we can verify what the mounting brackets look like. When I first introduced this topic a few episodes back, we had a very basic conceptual design for what we believed this modification might look like. This included 2 layers of perforated steel plates spanning across the tank, acting as a colander. Initially, we figured that the perforations through the plates would need to be appropriately sized to prevent particles of all expected sizes from passing through. In retrospect, we realized that this was a bit ridiculous because it would require creating hundreds of thousands of holes in the plate.
Over the past few months, we've spent a lot of time imagining how the hardworking team of Superheavy technicians, aka the booster surgeons, would actually assemble something like this inside of a completed vehicle. As a reminder, these retrofits had to be made on boosters 10, 11, 12, and 13 after they were fully stacked. With these manufacturability considerations in mind, let's take a look at how our initial theoretical design has evolved. Since we have no idea what this truly looks like, our design has to make use of the components that we know exist. The only other thing we have to go off of is Elon's description of the system.
We've improved the sort of ice strainers or the ice catchers.
Yep.
We've improved the valves.
Based on this, our goal was to create something that resembles the LOX inlet filters. This would still require perforated panels, but the holes would be significantly larger. The holes themselves are not responsible for trapping particles. Instead, that will be accomplished using a stainless steel mesh filtration screen over the top. The main limitation is that the rigid perforated steel panels would have to be small enough to fit inside the access hatch. Because these panels have to stretch from the outer wall to the landing tank, they would require an appropriate amount of supporting framework to be installed as well. This will be similar to a suspension grid for a drop-down ceiling.
So we know there are 2 rows of 42 triangular brackets welded to the inner wall of the tank. These brackets are twice as large as the ones used for the original slosh baffles. In this design, we are assuming that there are also matching brackets on the outside of the landing tank. To support the panels that will later be installed, there are main runners mounted between the brackets on the inner wall and the landing tank. There are also additional cross runners between each of the brackets, which divides each of the panels into 3 sections. Another design consideration we have to work around is the fact that we don't see any additional weld lines between the mounting brackets on the outside of the tank. The panels need to be supported on the outer edge, so we attached a hoop stiffener around the perimeter of the tank. Something like this wouldn't be visible from the outside like the mounting brackets because it would be welded to the stringers instead of the wall. Once the suspended frame is completed, the 3 groups of perforated panels are installed. There is a chance that the mesh screen might come pre-installed with the panels, but in this design we have installed them separately. To secure them in place,
There's a secondary frame bolted onto the original. This allows damaged sections of the stainless steel mesh to be replaced instead of the entire panel. One thing to consider is the need to access the engine plumbing at the bottom of the tank and the top of the landing tank. So near the access hatch, there needs to be some sort of trap door to allow booster surgeons to climb up and down between the 3 levels. It is possible that there is just a gap here with no paneling, but that would be a huge mistake. We will address that here in a few minutes. One of the unavoidable weaknesses of this design is the fact that there are open gaps around the edges between each of the 96 stringers. Again, because there are no weld marks visible between the brackets, we are assuming these gaps do exist. In my opinion, this gap around the edges may actually be a good thing to have, even though it has the potential to create problems. A filtration screen like this should initially allow for a very high pass-through rate of liquid through the holes in the mesh, but over time, the accumulation of particles may eventually cause flow restrictions through the mesh, which would starve the engines and create a pressure differential inside of the tank.
After all, this is quite a lot of snow and ice we're talking about here. Hold on, let me get closer for a second. As I mentioned before, we should expect up to 2,300 kilograms of CO2, but there will also be an additional 1,600 kilograms of water vapor. That's roughly 4 tons combined. Assuming all of that will eventually freeze inside of the tank, if we spread it out over the surface area of the screen, you would end up with 4.7 centimeters of snow and ice. That's just under 2 inches total. We don't have to worry about the water ice at this stage because it won't land on the filtration screen until the liquid drops below the surface. But there is about an inch of CO2 that will build up on the screen in the meantime, creating flow restrictions. By keeping these gaps around the edges, it would prevent a total blockage from occurring. This is kind of like an emergency spillway on a dam. I think the fact that there are 2 layers here is a sign that they're expecting there to be some overflow. Another possibility is that there is a larger mesh on the upper screen, which will only catch particles of a certain size, while the lower layer is a significantly smaller mesh to catch everything that passes through the first layer. A 3-tiered filtration system like this might be more ideal. But of course, even though the water ice doesn't contribute to the flow restriction issue, we still need to consider what happens when the liquid oxygen level drops below the upper screen. Some of the CO2 ice on the first layer may get crushed into smaller particles by the G-forces, allowing it to fall through the mesh. Also, if there is any lateral flow of liquid across the screen, larger particles may be shaved down and fall through as well. That depends on how abrasive the mesh is. To add to the remaining mass of snow, all 1,600 kilograms of water ice that was floating on the surface of the liquid should land on this upper level. With that said, the structure needs to be able to support all of that additional mass. While suspended above the surface of the liquid, the structural supports would have to fully bear their own weight plus several tons of ice and snow. The combined mass would be multiplied by the G-forces the booster is pulling during the boost back burn. So if the booster is experiencing 3 Gs while accelerating back towards the launch site, then 4 tons would feel like 12 tons. So with something resembling this solution in place, how was the snow still able to make its way to the bottom of the tank and clog the inlet filters on Flight 3? Well, in my opinion, I believe that roll maneuver may have ended up being an unexpected cheat code that allowed the ice to bypass the sieve screens. There are 2 possibilities for what could have caused this, and thanks again to our team of 3D forensics agents, we can visualize what I'm explaining here.
Returning to the Flight 3 flip maneuver for a 3rd time, for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, it's been snowing inside of the liquid oxygen tank. By the time Booster 11 reaches BECO, there will be up to 2 centimeters of snow particles accumulated between the 2 layers of the filtration screens. At the moment of hot staging, the ship ignites its 6 engines and pushes itself away from the booster. Even though it's about 50% less force than was used during Flight 2, it's still enough to create a brief moment of negative acceleration. This negative acceleration will lift the particles from both screens and cause them to briefly become suspended in the liquid oxygen.
So yeah, we weren't able to enable the acceleration that would simulate the particles being lifted from the screen without it exploding once we combine it with the other forces being simulated. So this is what that would look like when we isolate it from everything else.
Just like before, when the booster is performing its backflip, the suspended snow particles will begin falling towards the side of the tank that will be facing towards the Earth once the flip is completed. Some of the particles that were already on this side of the tank will end up falling through the gaps between the stringers. This problem will be amplified dramatically if the trapdoors that we mentioned previously do not exist. The access hatch for the LOX tank is located on this side of the vehicle. Without the trapdoor, this would be the path of least resistance for the liquid oxygen due to the accumulation of particles on the screen. The flow of LOX would likely sweep a lot of these particles down through this huge gap.
This is why I mentioned that leaving this gap uncovered would be a huge mistake.
Honestly, I can't imagine that SpaceX engineers would have overlooked a detail like this, but it's a design consideration that's definitely worth mentioning. We're trying to be as thorough as possible here. Anyway, the particles that fall through the gap between the stringers should collect on the bottom of the tank near the inlet filters for the outer 20 engines. Luckily, the outer 20 engines aren't operational at this time, so it's not really a big deal. But now, 12 seconds into the boost back burn, the 270-ton space ballerina performs a 120-degree pirouette over a period of 20 seconds. While the booster is rotating, the screen will obviously move with it. Similar to the Flight 2 situation, the liquid will want to remain stationary and will act like an underwater current, sweeping the particles across the screen. Once they are in motion, they will want to fall to the Earth-facing side of the vehicle, further increasing the amount of particles around the edge of the tank. Additionally, the stringers on the wall of the tank will create turbulence near the edge of the screen. The combination of these two dynamic forces will increase the amount of particles that fall through the gaps between the stringers. While this is happening, the roll will also create turbulence in the fluid at the bottom of the tank. This stirs up anything that fell during the flip maneuver and will help spread the new particles that make their way past the filtration screen as the vehicle is rotating. Over a period of 15 seconds, the inlet filters on the front half of the tank begin rapidly sucking in the snow particles, just like they did during IFT-2. When they finally reach their saturation point, the engines begin failing in a symmetrical sequence. It seems like the 4 remaining engines in the Ring of 10 were not affected like the ones on the Earth-facing side of the tank. Not only did these 4 do an excellent job of instantly adjusting the thrust vector control to counter the unbalanced thrust, but they appear to have made it to their intended shutdown point. We can tell the remaining engines shut down as planned because of the way the Flight 3 boost back burn telemetry lines up almost perfectly with the Flight 4 data. Beyond this, it seems like the ones that failed were completely disabled for the remainder of flight, while some of the ones that shut down as planned were able to successfully reignite for the landing burn. Before we move on, I want to remind you all again that this ice catcher overflow theory is 100% speculation. While it makes perfect sense to me, I admit I am less convinced of this being the chain of events that caused the failure of the engines on Flight 3. But this was the first idea that immediately occurred to me after reviewing the footage, so I felt it was worth including. My main hangup here is that it would require a pretty massive volume of particles to make their way past the screen through those gaps in the stringers, assuming that they exist. And it has to happen in an incredibly short period of time in order to cause this kind of rapid failure. With that said, there is a second scenario that I think we should also consider. Instead of simply spilling over the edge of the filtration screen, the sheer weight of the particles can actually cause a complete structural failure of the supporting framework. As I mentioned several times now, these filtration screens have to support up to 12 tons of ice and snow while the booster is accelerating back towards the launch site. The supporting framework should easily be able to bear this kind of weight as long as the particles are evenly distributed across the entire surface. But if a large portion of these particles shift to one side during the flip maneuver, it could potentially overburden the structure, resulting in a collapse. In particular, the main runners that are mounted between the brackets would be most at risk since there's nothing supporting them from below. Unlike all of the main structural components of the booster and ship, it's highly unlikely that SpaceX would have performed some sort of structural verification test on this suspended frame. It's possible that such a test could have been conducted inside of B-10 during the time that it spent receiving these upgrades in the booster bay. But it's extremely rare for SpaceX to perform a structural verification test using a vehicle that is intended to fly. We can also confirm that there were 0 test tanks produced in the time between flights 2 and 3. With no way to verify that the structure would be able to support the maximum load it could possibly encounter, the only alternative would be an in-flight test. While the booster is pulling more than 3 Gs at peak acceleration during boostback, if the upper screen were to collapse, it would crash into the lower level, likely resulting in a secondary collapse. Considering this possibility made me curious whether or not we should expect to see some sort of physical response from the booster. Several tons of material falling down to the bottom of the tank would surely cause an abrupt change in the center of gravity, which the avionics computer would have to adjust for. With this in mind, I decided to go back through the footage to see what I could find. When we're looking for things like this, sometimes it's helpful to adjust the playback speed in order to observe things that are extremely difficult to notice in real time. After increasing the playback speed by 500%, I happened to notice an interesting wobble that occurred during that 120-degree roll maneuver. This may not look like much, but once you see it from another perspective, it appears to be a lot more dramatic. Thanks to the space engineer who recreated the entire descent phase of Booster 10's flight by camera matching the outline of the Earth frame by frame, we're able to look at this from the external view. Once again, when we watch this in real-time speed, it's difficult to truly appreciate what's going on here. But if we increase the speed again by 500%, you can see that the roll maneuver is nowhere near as cute as I previously described it. Matter of fact, if I observed this as an orbital police officer, I think I would have enough probable cause to pull over and arrest Booster 10 on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. What you were seeing here is most definitely not supposed to happen. With all 13 engines running, the control authority should be extremely precise. We have all seen how easy it is for the electric TVC to move perfectly in sync with each other in order to initiate this type of maneuver. Without having anything to compare it to, this is exactly how I imagined the avionics computer would respond to severe fuel sloshing or a change in center of gravity due to an internal collapse like the one I've described. So, if the filtration screen buckles on the Earth-facing side of the tank and several tons of snow and ice falls to the bottom, then it will begin spreading outwards starting from the origin of the collapse. Again, while this is a highly speculative theory, it would explain why the engines failed in a symmetrical sequence.
So, if either of these theories are correct, then what could SpaceX do differently to prevent this from occurring on Flight 4? Well, if there is some kind of gap around the outer rim of the filtration screen, they could find a way of eliminating them. But if that's not an option, then it might be a good idea to be as gentle as possible with the booster during the flip maneuver and keep all the aerial acrobatics to an absolute minimum. Don't get me wrong, executing random in-flight maneuvers like this is great for testing the capabilities of the various attitude control systems. It's extremely valuable data to acquire for a prototype vehicle. But after the third flight test, SpaceX was now confident that Starship could successfully clear the pad and survive max Q. They proved that they can hot stage the ship without destroying both vehicles in the process, relight 13 engines on Superheavy for boost back, and guide it back through the atmosphere. For the most part. So for Flight 4, the top priority became making progress towards reaching the critical milestone of demonstrating reusability for both the booster and the ship. Anything that could possibly get in the way of those goals needed to be eliminated in order to increase their chances of success. For the ship, this included cutting out the second in-flight burn, propellant transfer between the main and header tanks, and payload bay testing so they can put all their focus into surviving reentry. And for the booster, this meant optimizing the stage separation procedure by completely eliminating the unnecessary roll maneuver, which ended up being ridiculously easy to do.
The simple solution is to make sure that the front of the booster is already in the correct orientation for the landing burn by the time it completes its flip maneuver. Some of you may have noticed that on Flight 4, the initial 90-degree roll maneuver while pitching down range went in the opposite direction than it did during the first 3 flights. This time around, the tiled side of the ship and the back of the booster were facing north instead of south. I've seen some speculation on X that the reason for this was to orient the tiles so that they would be facing the sun. This would allow SpaceX to inspect for missing tiles using the onboard cameras. The problem with that theory is that the tiles were already getting plenty of sunlight when they were facing towards the south. Turning them towards the north does not help with this at all. Instead, I think reversing the orientation is entirely related to optimizing stage separation and nothing else. This has been a continuous process, but I think it's finally dialed in now. As a reminder, SpaceX transitioned away from the Falcon Heavy side core power slide used on Flight 2 to the fadeaway backflip on Flight 3. The original power slide required a 90-degree roll to get the front facing down, and the backflip required a 120-degree roll. By flipping the direction that the tiles are facing before stage separation and rotating the grid fins in the opposite direction, the booster will still turn towards the south while performing the backflip. But now, at the end of the flip, the front side of the booster will already be facing towards the ground. And just like that, the unnecessary roll maneuvers have been completely eliminated, and as a result, it should be much easier to keep the ice trapped on the netting where it belongs.
As crazy as it sounds, I think this might be that software upgrade they mentioned during the live broadcast.
Now for today's flight, we upgraded those filters further and made some additional hardware and software changes to increase our chances of igniting all 13 engines for the landing burn.
When we compare the telemetry from all 3 flights, you can see that Flight 4 showed improvements in every single area that we've discussed. The ship acceleration is a lot smoother, and the pushback on the booster is less aggressive than the previous 2 attempts. As a result, the negative acceleration on the booster was 50% less than it was on Flight 3 and 75% less than Flight 2. And finally, the flip maneuver was roughly 25% faster than Flight 3 and 50% faster than Flight 2. I think each of these factors contributed to reducing the shifting of snow and ice inside of the tank, thereby increasing the effectiveness of the filtration system. It's pretty awesome being able to observe the incremental changes that are being made between flights in this way. I would say it's similar to what you would expect to see with PID tuning, but I don't think that would be the correct way of describing this.
So, to answer the question from earlier in the episode, has the liquid oxygen filter blockage problem been completely resolved? Well, in my opinion, if our speculation is correct, this might be more like a massive Superheavy sized band-aid. But while it's not ideal, it does seem to get the job done. I think the upcoming Flight 5 will provide another stress test to the system. There will be a lot of additional propellant burn during the boost back in order to return to the launch site this time around. And in the future, we will have to hope that it will also be able to handle the additional mass of CO2 and water vapor that will be generated once they stretch the propellant tanks on Superheavy V3.
It's possible that with Raptor 3, this issue will go away entirely. While speaking on this topic with the Everyday Astronaut, Allan mentioned that Raptor 3 will have a highly complex integrated cooling system built into the engine. While he didn't elaborate on this topic as much as I would have hoped, I think there is a chance this might end up eliminating the autogen contamination problem. Even though SpaceX has finally shared a few images of the new Raptor 3 during recent static fire testing at McGregor, there isn't enough to go off of to help us figure this out. The most we can really get out of this is knowing what parts of the engine are frosted over during operation. This kind of helps determine which components contain cryogenic liquids versus hot gas. Unfortunately, there is nothing visible that would help us identify which fluid is being used in this new cooling system. That happens to be a very important detail. We can safely assume that, like Raptor version 1 and 2, liquid methane is used in the regenerative cooling circuit for the main combustion chamber and expansion nozzles. But the rest of the engine is still a mystery at this point. One of the goals for Raptor 3 was to allow the engine to survive the heat generated by its own exhaust plume without the need for a heat shield. This is especially necessary while the booster is falling into the plume from the 13 center engines at the start of the landing burn. Based on Allan's statement, I think there may be some re-entry heating that they are also concerned with here. To accomplish this, both turbopumps and preburners will require their own integrated cooling systems. This will prevent them from being melted by the hot exhaust gases or plasma.
It's possible that methane will be used across the entire cooling system due to it being overall safer to work with. But it's equally likely that they may use LOX for the oxygen side of the engine. If so, the cooling system may act as a heat exchanger, vaporizing LOX and sending hot gaseous oxygen back to the main tank. In other words, no more tapping into the pre-burner exhaust and no more CO2 and water vapor contamination to deal with. Anything we say on this topic right now is pure speculation though. Once we have more information, I'll be sure to provide an update on a future episode. In the meantime, there's still one more major problem that we'll have to deal with, and that is the current autogen system's impact on rapid reusability. After the booster is successfully caught by the chopsticks, the remaining propellants will boil off along with the CO2 dry ice. After all of that is gone, the water ice will melt and leave 1.6 cubic meters, or 420 gallons, of contaminated water at the bottom of the tank. If you attempt to do a quick turnaround with the booster, the water will likely freeze solid on the bottom of the tank once you begin loading liquid oxygen. If it managed to float to the surface instead without causing issues, you would still end up with double the amount of water left in the tank after the second flight. This means that before the booster can be reflown, someone is going to have to get inside of the LOX tank, climb down past that filtration screen, and vacuum all that water out.
This is bullshit. Hey, yo, for real, let's get that AC rolling. And you know damn well I need a bigger vacuum. Stop playing with me.
While we're on the subject of landing boosters, I think some of you may be wondering whether or not it's even safe to bring this thing back to the launch site on the next flight attempt. You may have noticed that I barely mentioned the landing tank at all during this long investigation. With how small this header tank is compared to the main tank, one would think CO2 and water vapor contamination would also be a concern here. If you have 13 engines dumping pre-burner exhaust into this tank during the landing burn, then there would also be a risk of significant ice formation during this extremely critical phase of flight. So, should there be some sort of filtration system inside of this tank as well? As far as we know, it is possible that there could be inlet filters over the openings for the pipes leading to the ring of 10 engines. For the 3 center engines, there would need to be a screen over each of the 3 sumps since you can't really fit filters in here. If this is the case, then hopefully the landing tank filtration system went through enough of a stress test during Flight 4 so we don't have to worry about engines failing on the final approach to the tower. I know that might sound kind of sketchy, but if it makes you feel any better, I'm pretty sure there is actually nothing to worry about here. After conferring with the ring watchers, we are fairly confident that there is no autogenous pressurization system for the landing tank. Of course, we can't say this for certain, but evidence seems to suggest that they're actually using COPVs to pressure the landing tank instead. On the top of the tank, there is a filtered valve which we believe is used for top-down filling of the header tank, or a depress valve for equalizing pressure with the main tank. Next to that, there is a 90-degree pipe which happens to be pointing directly towards one of the strakes where the COPV tanks are mounted on the outside of the vehicle. I think it makes more sense for SpaceX to use COPVs here, given how small the tank is. Not only would the gas be immediately available at the moment of engine startup, but the pressure regulation controls are probably a lot more precise than the autogen system as well.
With that said, we can probably cross this off the list of things to worry about for the first chopstick landing attempt on Flight 5. And that's good because the list is pretty long already. One of the other things people have expressed concern with is the possibility of Superheavy running out of fuel during the landing burn. If you saw my last episode, then you're probably aware that Superheavy has gained a considerable amount of weight after all of the upgrades that have been made over the past year and a half or so. As I mentioned in that episode, the size of the landing tank dictates how much fuel is available for the landing burn. The landing tank was originally designed for a booster that was expected to weigh 50 tons less than it does currently. Of course, the booster seemed to do just fine during Flight 4, but the requirements may be a little different during the upcoming RTLS landing attempt. Honestly, I'm not sure how the fuel requirements for the landing burn changes between those two situations. Either way, what we do know is that SpaceX has actually decided to increase the capacity for the landing tanks. If you remember at the beginning of the episode, this was first observed with Booster 15's aft section when it was spotted being moved into the megabay. Now, in my opinion, it doesn't really make sense for this to appear for the first time on a booster that's sitting back 4 places deep on the launch manifest list. So with that said, we've been looking out for additional evidence that this was also installed in Booster 15's older siblings. Lo and behold, on August 21st, we witnessed 10 of these pressure vessels being transported to the megabay. Now that we were able to see these outside of the aft section, we can use some pixel math to figure out its dimensions and also observe the large 90-degree pipe coming off the bottom of the tank. So thanks to Chameleon Circuit, we can confirm that these 24-inch diameter tanks are perfectly sized to fit through the access hatch on the LOX tank. It just requires a little finesse, I think, to get it in there. We also observed a small crane delivered to the megabay just before these arrived. We aren't sure if this crane is mounted inside of the tank or something, but we believe it was used to assist with the install. We believe these are now being retrofitted into boosters 12, 13, and 14. That's assuming that 12 wasn't the first one to receive these in the first place. Now, honestly, I'm really not the biggest fan of how these look, especially since, well, you know. But this definitely serves an important purpose for the booster, even though we can't say for sure why it's necessary. What we do know is that there are at least 9 of these large cylinders mounted to the landing tank. The small pipe on the top allows them to equalize pressure with the landing tank. Now that we know that a 90-degree pipe comes off the bottom side, we know that these are intended to supply additional liquid oxygen for the landing burn. Through some basic calculations, we've determined that this increases the volume of LOX available for the landing burn by 23%. That's kind of a lot, and I don't think that kind of increase would purely be for allowing the booster to land with its hot stage ring still attached. In all honesty, I'm not really expecting that SpaceX is truly intending on returning with the hot stage ring anytime soon. So with that said, it will be interesting if we can observe something noticeable during the landing burn on Flight 5 that will explain this. Before you ask, I'm not really sure how the support brackets for the filtration screen would need to be redesigned in order to accommodate these tanks. That's a problem for another day. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do us a favor and leave us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We are on a mission to reach 100,000 subscribers, and we could really use your help in getting there. This is an awesome free way of showing your support. If you would like to support the channel even further, please consider becoming a member of the channel or a monthly supporter on Patreon. Honestly, we've been losing a lot of members lately due to the time between episodes, but hopefully you all appreciate how much effort goes into producing these feature-length documentaries. By becoming a patron, you give us the ability to compensate our 3D forensics agents like Hansen Space, Chameleon Circuit, Seabass Productions, The Space Engineer, Knaggs, and Virtual Space 3D for the amazing custom renders and animations used in these episodes. Huge shout out to each of them for their individual contributions. These things take hundreds of hours to put together, and we really wouldn't be able to cover these topics without them. Of course, I also want to thank the Everyday Astronaut and Cosmic Perspective, RGV Aerial, Starship Gazer, Lab Padre, NASA Spaceflight, and everyone else whose content was used in today's episode. You can find the links to each of their channels in the description below. Last but not least,
Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring today's deep dive investigation. All right, that's my time for today. I hope to see you all next time. For now, this is Stage Zero Zach, signing off.